Hi, good morning, dear friends. Today I am presenting before you the life of a great person. At the outset, let me ask you something. Do you know who is the author of the classic book Utopia? Well, if you find it difficult to recall to mind, the author is Sir Thomas More or Saint Thomas More. He is a saint in the Catholic Church. He was holding the position of a prime minister in our own terms at the time of King Henry VIII of England. Now, I do not want to make you wait too long. Now you will see a short description of the life of Saint Thomas More. Watch this carefully and then we will reflect some time on this after that. Thank you.
This is the story of Saint Thomas More, the great martyr of England. There are a very few people who have not heard of Saint Thomas More. He started his career as a lawyer and in course of time he became a judge. Finally, he rose to the position of the Lord Chancellor of the Exchequer. He wrote several books, of which the most famous was the Utopia. It was modeled on Plato's Republic and it deals with the eternal problem of riches and poverty. This great work carved a niche for him in the world of literature. In spite of his genius and reputation, he was God-fearing, humble and charitable. He was accessible to all and a great friend of the poor and needy. He was a loving husband, an affectionate father, and a role model for youth. In the midst of riches and glory, he was a man of deep faith and spirituality. He used to wear a hair shirt inside his dress as a mark of penance. Every day he attended the Holy Mass and served in the Mass. The story of his noble and virtuous life, which culminated in martyrdom, has been a source of inspiration to generations. Martyrdom is a gift of God, which is the climax of the love of God. Birth and early life. Thomas More was born in London in the year 1478. His father was a lawyer who had other children too. He found it difficult to make both ends meet with his meager income. Hence, Thomas More had often experienced hunger in his childhood. Perhaps this early experience of poverty might have contributed to his love of the poor. However, Thomas More was a healthy child, exceptionally intelligent and always pleasant with a rare sense of wit and humor. He was fond of books and a good actor too. He had a soft corner in his mind, not only for suffering people but also for animals and birds. He would keep his promises, and morality was his great quality. All people liked him. He was about 10 years old when he began to live with Canterbury Archbishop John Morton in his Lambeth Place. Thomas More was deeply influenced by this saintly archbishop, who was later elevated to the position of a cardinal. Their friendship became strong and lasting as years passed. At Oxford, although not old enough for university education, he joined the Oxford University as a law student at the age of 14. Considering his intellectual ability, his father and Archbishop John Morton thought that it would be useful for him. During his study at Oxford, he had experienced sometimes cold and hunger. At last, he joined a hostel called Charterhouse, run by the Carthusian monks in London. During his stay there, he thought of choosing a state of life. For some time, he was not able to decide whether to become a monk or to get married. At last, he took the decision of getting married and then left the Charterhouse. Marriage and family. He was now 27 years old. he was a successful lawyer and had earned sufficient money with which he purchased a good house in London. He had already selected his bride as well. Her name was Jane Colt, daughter of a rich gentleman who lived in Hertfordshire. Thomas More was very particular that his wife should learn Latin and go to Mass every day. Miss Jane Colt found it very difficult to do these things at first, but later she adjusted herself to her husband's desire, and thereafter their married life became smooth, flowing, and happy. The birth of 4 children, 3 daughters, and a son added to their conjugal bliss. Thomas More intensely loved his wife and children. Before boarding the boat to go to office, he would kiss them on their head. Thomas More loved his eldest daughter, Margaret, called Meg most of the time. He would share his thoughts and ideas with her. At the time of his martyrdom, she pushed through the crowd. She reached her father and embraced and kissed him openly, disregarding the mood of the onlookers. However, this blissful life of Thomas More did not last long. Jane Colt fell ill and died unexpectedly. It was indeed a heavy blow to the family. But Thomas More, who was a spiritual man, surrendered himself totally to the will of God and suffered the irreparable loss with fortitude. Now there was nobody to look after his young children, so dear and near to his heart. In these circumstances, he was forced to think of another marriage. Thomas More married now a widow named Alice Middleton. She proved to be a loving stepmother and managed More's household efficiently. It was about this time that More shifted his residence from London to Chelsea. He had a large household. It was a joint family with his children, their spouses, grandchildren, and helpers. There was a library and a small zoo also. There were several rooms and a few kitchens. By this time, Thomas More was famous throughout Europe, and scholars as well as distinguished men used to visit his house regularly. The most famous among them was a scholar named Erasmus. He was a close friend of Thomas More. Owing to financial difficulties, Erasmus often had to depend on More's hospitality and charity. Lord Chancellor of England Henry VIII, the King of England, also was a frequent visitor. He was very much impressed by More's learning and his reputation as a just judge. He decided to appoint him as the Lord Chancellor of the Exchequer. It was the highest office in the kingdom, next only to that of the king. It was the prototype of the office of the Prince Minister in England. Thomas More accepted this appointment, but he must have suspected that it would lead in future to some undesirable consequences, because Henry VIII was a worldly, selfish, pleasure-loving monarch who followed his own whims and fancies. By contrast, Thomas More was a spiritual man who was always experienced in the presence of the nearness to God. He was not of this world, although he was in this world. What coexistence could there be between darkness and light? Thomas More managed the affairs of the kingdom efficiently for 2 years. He was loved and respected by Henry VIII, who knighted him. Thomas More became Sir Thomas More. Henry's rift with the church. Now there was a strange turn of events. Henry VIII decided to divorce his wife Catherine of Aragon and to marry the court maid Anne Boleyn. The reason given by the king was that Catherine had not given birth to a male child who would succeed him on the throne. According to the teachings of the church, a valid marriage cannot be divorced. Nobody can do this. Even the Pope has no authority to do so. The divine commandment regarding marriage is that no man shall set asunder what God has joined. Naturally, when Henry approached the Pope for divorce, his request was rejected. The king became furious and declared himself to be the supreme head of the church in England. Queen Catherine was divorced and the monarch married Anne Boleyn. Now these actions had to be legally ratified. For this, Henry got 2 acts passed. by the Parliament, which he influenced and controlled. The two acts were the Act of Supremacy and the Act of Succession. The Act of Supremacy declared that the king was the supreme head of the church in England, and the Act of Succession said that Anne Boleyn's child would succeed the king on the throne. Now these two acts were to be approved by the English citizens, Cardinal Wolsey, bishops, monks, intellectuals, and the members of Parliament took the two oaths supporting the acts, but Cardinal John Fisher and the Thomas More would not do so. They had no objection to the Act of Succession, but they could not support the Act of Supremacy, since it was opposed to true faith, and both of them would die as martyrs. Martyrdom. Thomas More's family was facing a crisis. More's wife and children, with tears in their eyes, persuaded him to take the oath and save his life, but he would not and could not act against his conscience. Before his death, More said that he had never done anything against his conscience. Now, Thomas More was a great man, famous throughout Europe, and a close friend of Henry VIII. So the king employed all his pressure tactics to have him converted to his opinion. But when all those attempts failed, Henry determined to take revenge upon him. Thomas More was arrested on a charge of treason and imprisoned in the London Tower, the notorious prison in London. In the early stages of his imprisonment, he was treated with respect. He was given a pen and paper, as he was a writer. Thomas More, who used to meditate in prison on the sufferings and the death of his Redeemer, Jesus Christ, started to write treatises on the Passion. But he could not complete it before his execution. On July 1st, 1535, the summons came quite early on that morning. The lieutenant of the Tower appeared before Thomas More. He said an order has just been received for his trial in Westminster Hall. He was led to that place. When he reached the hall, he had changed beyond recognition. Indeed, those who were waiting for him were shocked by his appearance. He looked much older, and his clothes hung loosely round him. He, who had always been clean-shaved, now wore a beard. At the trial, he answered all the points brought against him, often with great wit, and actually his judges stood condemned before him several times. However, that made no difference to the verdict, which all knew was waiting for him. At last it came. He was to die in a few days' time. His death was to be the same as that of Carthusian monks who had been hanged a few days ago. Thomas More was calm and composed. He smiled and prayed for the judges who had sentenced him to death. He expressed his hope and desire that he would meet them in heaven. He had 5 days more to live. Crowds watched him moving in the barge to the tower, around which they were tense. Among them, last was his dearest daughter, Meg. She pressed forward among throng, and the company of guards hastily ran to her father, and there, openly in the sight of everyone, embraced him and kissed him again and again. Thomas More consoled her and asked her only to pray for him. The 5 days passed. Thomas More was to be hanged on the morning of July 6th. Then he learned that his sentence was changed. He was not to be hanged, but to be executed on the Tower Hill. He did not see again Meg or anyone of his family. 9 o'clock was the time fixed for his execution. Crowds, silent and full of sympathy for him, watched him moving to the scaffold. The steps of the scaffold were so steep that he found them difficult to mount. He spoke jokingly, "Help me to go up. Downward I shall come alone." Then he asked the bystanders to pray for him. He said he would pray for them in heaven. He then begged them to pray for the king. He said that he was dying, the king's good servant, but God's servant first. As he knelt before the block, he swept his long beard aside and made his well-known joke that it had done no evil, and hence it should not be allowed to suffer any harm. A few moments later, the axe was raised, and it fell upon his neck. His head was severed. It was held up for the silent crowd to see it. Later, it was put on a stake and placed on the London Bridge. The people said that the king's wrath was death, so was his friendship too. After a few years, his beloved queen, Anne Boleyn, was put to death. His trusted servant, Thomas Cromwell, also was executed. After the execution of Thomas More, his body was taken to the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, close by. The head was removed by Meg a few weeks later and buried in the Roper family vault at the church of St. Dunstan, Canterbury. Conclusion. The news of the death of Thomas More brought a feeling of horror to the people and also of shame to the whole of England. The rulers and the scholars of Europe were all shocked by it. Ursimus was so stunned that he could hardly speak. He whispered silently, "I feel as though I had died with him." Henry VIII, whose hands were blood-stained, executed many others later, but among them all none was finer than the Lord Chancellor Thomas More's. He shines like a star in history, while Henry's name is almost forgotten.
Dear friends, do you like the short movie that you had just seen? Well, does this story ring a bell in your mind? Maybe something that happened in recent times? To my mind, to bring some memories of Father Stan Swami, who died recently. A man who, following the principles of Christ for serving the downtrodden, who, following the principles of Christ, the teachings of Christ, stood by the side of the poor people, the oppressed of the North Indian social setup, of the Dalits, and then he had to suffer on account of that. He was arrested, he was put in jail, then when he was sick, he was sent to the hospital, and there he dies. Even without having the facility of a straw to drink some water, or to have a sipper to be able to drink something, because he was not able to drink something as he was suffering from Parkinson's disease. Now this man too died, and all people of goodwill, they have actually really expressed their sorrow and anguish over the death of this great man. Now, what does religious responsibility mean? Is it performing some ceremonies or doing some certain actions, maybe in the church or the temple? I think those are important, but more than that, religious responsibility means to be able to live according to the principles of Unsundram, according to what the religion teaches you. And this is what we see in the life of St. Thomas More as well as that of Father Stan Swami. It is standing for certain principles first and foremost. Now let's get back to the topic that we are going to deal with, the chapter on performing religious responsibilities. Tomorrow when you come, go through this chapter and also keep in mind what you have seen in this video today. Thank you.